I'm Julie Hyman coming to you from my home, and I want to bring in Rick Newman from his home now. Rick, we've been talking a lot about the stimulus, right? The proposals and now approved bill coming to us from Congress. Can you give us more details on what exactly that plan entails and what it's going to do for people and how quickly it goes into effect?
Yeah, we've got a lot of stimulus bills to keep track of here. So the one that President Trump signed yesterday, this is a fairly limited stimulus bill. This is not the checks being mailed out to everybody. We're not quite there yet. What this would do would provide some funding so that people whose companies do not provide 2 weeks of sick leave or emergency leave, there would be some funding for that. There's also funding to cover the cost of coronavirus tests for people who get them and don't have coverage through insurance or something like that. So President Trump has signed that, but that is about $100 billion worth of stimulus. And this much bigger bill that's coming probably within a couple of weeks could be easily $1 trillion. And we're hearing perhaps even now 2 trillion or 3 trillion. This would include a lot of different things similar to that big bailout bill back in February of 2009. One of the things would be the checks that go out to people, probably in 2 different batches, one in April and May. There's certainly going to be some help for companies. At the briefing today, somebody asked President Trump, does he support the idea of having prohibitions in there so that companies that get aid from the government, a taxpayer bailout, cannot turn around and go and give executives bonuses or do share buybacks? And he did say he supports that idea. So I think we're going to see across the board support for that. I think that means maybe we will see better bailouts this time around than we saw back in 2009.
Yeah, we all remember the AIG bailout, and I was curious, might we see the potential for Treasury, the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve, you would need some act of Congress to own stock in companies. Is that potentially part of this package that's being negotiated?
Well, that's the template from 2008 and 2009. I mean, the government took ownership in some companies. Perhaps one of the best known examples was General Motors when GM declared bankruptcy. The U.S. Treasury became a part owner of General Motors. I believe the Canadian government did as well. That did not work out so well for the government. The government actually lost money on that deal. But when the government takes an ownership stake, that is a way of the government having a say in what happens next. And then you have to negotiate, well, to what extent does the government actually put people on the board of directors? I mean, this was contentious with the GM bailout. And the Treasury Department basically got out of that deal after a couple of years because they said, this is back in the Obama administration, we really don't be wanting to tell GM how to run their business. We would prefer to get our money back, but we'd rather just get out of this deal. So there are a lot of things to be negotiated there. But one of the things that happens if the government actually takes an ownership stake is you dilute the shares of the existing shareholders. And in some ways, that is, you could argue that that's appropriate because these companies, they are getting taxpayer bailouts. You do want to be careful that you're really helping the people who need it most. And the shareholders generally are not the people who need it most. Shareholders tend to be wealthier Americans, obviously. So these are many of the intricacies that they're still going to have to work out. And Adam, you're right. Most of this does require congressional legislation.
And Rick, with that Treasury proposal, I know $150 billion as of now is allocated to other essential sectors, critical sectors outside of airlines. Let's think about this, right? The restaurant industry has asked for $150 billion itself. The hotel industry has asked for the same, around, I think, 145. So if you think about how are you going to rank these industries in terms of importance in our society?
That's exactly right. And in a way, smaller businesses are collectively more important than bigger businesses. I don't have the stats at my disposal right here, but smaller businesses, companies with 500 employees or fewer. These are not S&P 500 companies. Those smaller businesses employ a majority of Americans, and in some ways they're more fragile. I mean, they are. They have less cash reserves, and they rely on monthly or even daily cash flow to keep operating. So again, there is a template for this that goes back to 2008 and 2009, and it's the whole alphabet soup of programs. Some are run by the Treasury, some are run by the Fed, some of them are run in combination. but you need to have a way for companies to access government lending facilities. And hopefully, I mean, we're getting some of that already, but it's complicated. And I actually think Steven Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, he's been a little shaky up till now, but he actually seems to be doing a good job. He does seem like he gets the urgency of this, and he is a banker. I mean, he owned a bank before he became Treasury Secretary. So at least he understands this, and there are a lot of professionals at the Fed, and there's a lot of case history for how to do this from 2008 and 2009. So that is a possible note for optimism.
Yeah, Rick, Dan here. I was just going to chime in and say I'm glad you mentioned that the small businesses are arguably more important at this time. You know, we've already been hearing for a week about the idea of bailing out the airlines. Boeing is pushing for it, and some have even mentioned bailing out the cruise lines, which, boy, that doesn't seem imperative right now. But it's the small businesses that I think we should really be concerned about and focused on. Everyone has mentioned, of course, the restaurants and smaller restaurant chains or even independent restaurants. We had a great restaurant industry analyst on our airwaves earlier today talking about, you know, a lot of these companies are just going to go under. You know, they can't survive even just 2 months of brutal losses, much less pay their employees during this time. But not only restaurants, I mean, the number of industries and corners of the economy that this hits, I keep thinking of gig workers, entrepreneurs, startup workers, anyone that is in an independent place that doesn't have any kind of big organization backing them. Boy, I hope the government thinks of those organizations and those companies in that part of the economy.
And I think that's happening. We are seeing a lot of pressure from, it started with Democrats, but I think Republicans have to get on board here, that these bailouts have to bail out Main Street first and companies second. I mean, that was the biggest complaint about the 2008 and 2009 bailouts, that the idea was if Washington saves the company, then the company will save the jobs. And that didn't happen. It took more than 6 years to get all the jobs back we lost, the longest since the Great Depression. So that's why you're hearing a lot of talk about how do we help the workers first. It's complicated, and you know, we have many more gig workers than we had during the last set of bailouts in the last recession 11 years ago. So those are the so-called 1099s, the independent contractors, and that is one of the reasons economists want to get money. Just give those people cash right away. But if you think about it, if you're an individual in your 20s or 30s and you're an Uber driver, and you get $1,000 for the government, how long does that tide you over? It helps, right, but it's not going to pay your rent for 6 months. So
yeah, and if you're a small business owner, that money doesn't necessarily keep your doors open.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.